Hello and welcome to Wooden Teeth, a podcast about truth-telling on politics, policy, and health. I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today's truth. The real profile of the Make America Healthy Again movement is different from what's popularly caricatured, especially by the left. And our guest today thinks that public health could actually learn a thing or two from MAHA. I took notice when I read the headline of Craig Spencer's piece in The Atlantic, which read, "Public Health Needs MAHA," subtitle, "The Field Must Swallow Its Pride and Admit Where the Insurgent Movement is Right." I read the piece and I was even more intrigued. Dr. Spencer pointed out that, for example, there is at least the appearance that health institutions have been captured by the industries like pharma they're supposed to regulate. He pointed out that people actually do want action on environmental pollutants and ultra-processed foods, and he contends that public health should be more aggressive and not lulled into paralysis by analysis. So I had to invite Dr. Spencer onto the podcast. When he is not writing provocative articles in The Atlantic, he is an emergency medicine physician and a professor at Brown University. So let's go talk to Dr. Craig Spencer. Dr. Craig Spencer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to chat with you. Thanks for reaching out.
Yeah, I was excited by your article and I'm interested in the reactions. You got to it, your journey to getting there, but let's start with base one, which is how did you become familiar in the first place with MAHA? Like, what was that journey like? And how did that lead you to an understanding of the movement that may be different from what is popularly understood?
Yeah. Well, let me just start by saying, thanks for having me. Thanks for chatting about this. But also, it's just a bit of background. I have worked in global health for the last 15 years. The majority of my life was working abroad in projects responding to things like hepatitis or Ebola, or in the middle of civil conflict, providing trauma care in Burundi. And, I kind of lived a separate life through my abroad life, which was global health. And I'd come back to the US. I'd worked clinically and primarily in New York City for a really long time. Kind of lived two different versions of, home and away. And throughout that whole time, the closest people in my life were people I had profound disagreements with politically, culturally, but they were a big part of my life. And I grew up as a Midwestern middle child in Detroit. That's what my origins are. And so I think I've long had a predilection for trying to kind of think about issues and how we move forward in a bit of a different way than I think a lot of folks, primarily in the medical space. I work in emergency medicine. ER docs get to experience what happens when the rest of the safety net falls apart and social issues all run downhill. And so throughout my career, 18 years in emergency medicine, I've kind of seen, the anger and the frustration that people have had with the medical and the public health establishment. And I know for, a lot of us, the last year and a half has been pretty cataclysmic. And I think, rightly so. It's been really disorienting in terms of the issues that we've seen elevated, the problems that we've seen made, the funding cuts, et cetera. But I've tried to look at this moment as an opportunity in the entropy. Does not mean that we should overlook or, understate how much has happened in the past year and a half that will have long-term implications. But I also recognize that we are in a moment where we're hearing about frustrations that Americans have long had. We are seeing how they're being built into coalitions, some of which could be and have been profoundly dangerous, others which I hope can move health and medicine forward if we're able to recognize the opportunity here. And a lot of that has come through conversations I've been having with people that think differently than myself, people that disagree or maybe agree somewhat with, where I come from as someone in medicine and in public health. And that has led me into rooms and spaces over the past year, some of which were pretty disorienting, like being at Children's Health Defense in Austin in November. Children's Health Defense, for folks that don't know, is the organization started by RFK Jr. It is described as an anti-vaccine organization, which it certainly works a lot towards, but it also encompasses some other health issues. But I've also, the majority of the time, have spent in rooms with people that maybe find themselves as aligned with MAHA, or maybe just are angry with the status quo in American medicine and in healthcare, and have tried to take this opportunity to listen, to learn, to think about how we build a better health and medical environment going forward. And yeah, so this has been a lot of my mental space, and that's what I was trying to reflect in this piece that I wrote a few weeks ago for The Atlantic.
Do you get a different reaction from folks when you present yourself either as an emergency medicine doc versus a professor at the School of Public Health at Brown University? Do people regard you differently, treat you differently, and if so, how?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think of this so clearly. In 2020, I was working in New York City during COVID. I was, March 2020, I was in a hospital in Manhattan and I saw the absolute apocalypse. I saw more people die per day than I would see while working in an Ebola treatment center in Guinea. It was horrific and it was horrible. And I remember, going on CNN or Fox or whatever it was, or writing about my experience and about what I thought we needed to do in terms of our health response, and how, maybe the first month or two, the reaction was, one of broad support. But later it transitioned into whenever I felt I was talking with a medical hat on, with a doctor hat on, I'd get applause and pots and pans of support. And whenever I spoke about the public health aspects, it felt more like pitchforks, and that some of the things were meant to be contested, and that as I changed hats, my perspective must have fully and fundamentally changed, at least in the eyes of some, because they weren't as willing to see or to accept with the same clarity my thoughts on kind of the public health aspects of this, as opposed to the physician lived experience aspect of it. So starting in 2020, absolutely saw how, depending on what angle you were speaking from, could change whether or not the public was willing to give you a listen and to follow, or to give you the leeway needed to make a point and to, hopefully make some impact.
So you've spent some time speaking with folks in the MAHA movement. It sounds like attending conferences, having other interactions. What is most misunderstood, do you think, popularly about the movement?
What I've noticed is that a large misunderstanding is this conflation of the movement with its leader. This idea that if you adopt the MAHA label, you must think that RFK Jr. and everything that he says is correct. You must be fervently anti-vaccine and have never received or never again want to receive a vaccine in your life if you respect anything that RFK Jr. has done or that the broader MAHA movement supports. And to be clear, some of that is true. There are people in the MAHA movement that were brought there for a coalition that was willing to accept criticism of traditional vaccines, vaccine structure, even, the science around vaccines. But what I've learned as part of these conversations is that that's a relatively small portion of the people who were drawn to MAHA for a whole host of other reasons. And the metaphor that I give for folks to try to truly understand what the movement is, what it looks like, and why it's important to understand going forward if we want to build back a stronger health, public health system is, imagine a big tent. It's a massive tent. And the MAHA movement is this large tent that has brought in a bunch of coalitions. Many of these coalitions existed long before the MAHA label existed. So people working on environmental justice, environmental rights, on vaccines, sure, on food, the whole host of things that you'll find at public health schools. Many of these people were kind of traditionally aligned, maybe consider themselves liberals, Democrats. Many of them may have been outside, may have been libertarians. The policies and the politics of the people that were brought under that tent were incredibly varied. And in the back corner, at a pretty small table, is an anti-vaccine group that is remarkably loud and has the best sound system. And if you were listening from the outside, you would think that all of the language, all of the messaging coming from the inside is from this one group that actually occupies a pretty small spot in the back of the tent. Not to say that the anti-vaccine movement has not been deliberate or destructive or incredibly problematic, but to say that it has had an outside influence, particularly in social media and a lot of the conversations that have been kind of part of the broader conversation. What I've seen within that larger MAHA tent is a bunch of folks milling about with similar anger at corporations, at pharmaceutical companies, at expertise, things that they feel like has not particularly delivered for them and for which there has been no accountability. And I think that's understandable. It's fine. Like so much of what MAHA has pulled under its tent is not new. These are issues that folks have been, including people in public health, have been working on for a really long time. Public health has been working to build the database that I think MAHA has used over the past year and a half, 2 years to show that, environmental exposures can be toxic and problematic. Things like paraquat, glyphosate, the problem with our food supply, chronic disease, and a focus on certain aspects of health at the expense of others. And I think that's all fine. If you understand that characterization, that's one thing. What I see as the bigger problem is that outside of that tent, I think what people within the MAHA movement see are a bunch of people out there wagging their fingers anytime they want to come out. And if you want to venture outside of the MAHA tent, and again, to be clear, I think that the MAHA movement itself is actually falling apart. I think it's slowly fading. I think a year from now, it will not exist in a similar form to what it looks like today. But the people that are part of it now are going to have the same frustrations, the same energy, the same desire to do something, and they're going to want to come out of this tent. And the question is, who are they going to be welcomed by? Are they going to be welcomed by a community within public health that wags their fingers at them and says that we can't trust you because you were in the tent with a bunch of people who think, vaccines cause autism? Or are we going to be willing to have some grace to say, maybe we don't agree on everything, but there's a lot that we do agree on, and I want to work together with you on these things. And I think that ultimately and fundamentally is going to be the difference between whether we have this pendular shift in public health, whether every 4 years or, more frequently or less frequently, we have an administration that comes in and is able to co-opt the anger that Americans have with health, justifiable anger that Americans have with health in this country, to put in place someone who they see as both, dogmatic, orthodox on whatever their, remarkably either fringe or just like very impassioned position is going to be on one side or the other. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what I was writing about in that piece is that may work for politics. Maybe you can win on a coalition that only gets 50.1% of the vote, but that can't work for public health. You can't have a public health that cleaves off 10, 20, 30, 40% of the population. And if we trust KFF polling and other polling, it's over 40% of people that identify somehow with MAHA. Now, I think for a lot of people that I work with and talk with, that seems so hard for them to believe because either they haven't spoken to anyone who's willing to admit that, or they haven't worked with people in the MAHA movement. But you're talking about nearly half of the country. And these are people from all over the political spectrum, even if a lot of them are MAGA aligned. Some of them are independents. Some of them are Democrats. Some of them were former liberals. Some of them are libertarians. Regardless, it's 40% of the public. You cannot have robust public health if we just cleave off and don't include 40% of the public. That does not necessarily mean we need to bring all of those issues and, find common ground on whether vaccines cause autism. But I think if we want to do things like save vaccine infrastructure in this country, we need to truly engage the good faith actors, people that have legitimate concerns about health and medicine in the U.S., find ways forward as opposed to just knee-jerk rejecting anyone or anything that we feel like doesn't fit with our own understanding of health.
So do you think that the MAHA movement is going to disintegrate because they have a leader that isn't truly representative of the movement, or because of other disagreements within the movement?
If you look at what MAHA was 2 years ago, essentially got started as a joke, right? Like the whole MAHA label being taken from MAGA. There's a lot of people in MAHA themselves that don't even like that, right? Like it was essentially a joke at the outset that ended up becoming a broader coalition than anyone expected. I think it was remarkably powerful in how it captured the culture and the consciousness of many people. I think it is in decline. Again, I think that, a lot of this was built up around RFK Jr. and the promises that he brought in. But anyone who has had their eyes opened over the last year or year and a half, even people within MAHA will tell you that they have failed to deliver on so many of their promises. Like, give me a strong MAHA win. Sure, red dye, sure, some things on foods. Like in terms of policy, if I were RFK Jr., I would look back over the past year and a half and say, okay, I've had some wins, but ultimately this has been kind of a failure and I haven't delivered in the way that people wanted me to. I think that's one thing, but I think what he has done is largely change the public consciousness and conversation around things like food, the environment, what people are concerned about, what they're eating, the concern about corporate influence, the concern about pharmaceutical companies that, again, this is not niche or new. This is stuff that has been identified by a big swath of the American public for a long time, which I think explains a lot of the allure of RFK Jr. and the MAHA movement. I think that we could potentially take the wrong lessons away from what will happen likely in the coming months if there is a political shift and if it is felt that, RFK Jr. is no longer useful for the administration, he leaves, he resigns, or he's pushed out. I do suspect that a lot of the work that he has personally put forward on vaccines to fall by the wayside. I don't think that it has broad support in any of the other institutions, CDC, FDA, others that would oversee this. I do see continuing concerns around hesitancy and declining rates of vaccination, et cetera. But what I see as more likely is that once RFK Jr. is gone, and again, even folks within the MAHA movement now, I was recently on a podcast with Robert Malone, who used to chair ACIP, talking about Ebola, and he said that RFK Jr. is not the head of the MAHA movement right now. If you look at the politics of what's happened, how RFK Jr. has been overruled on glyphosate. This was like the one thing that was one of his biggest wins, right? Was this case against Monsanto before he joined this administration, the environmental work around glyphosate and trying to link it to cancer. He had to stand by as an administration, signed an executive order, essentially overruling and undoing one of his most important, life projects and achievements. The EPA has also rolled back restrictions on coal-powered plants and, the pollution they can put into the air. And so I think, on the net, even for folks in the MAHA movement, they're not particularly happy about what's got done, what hasn't got done, what remains. But I do think that there has been, and this is why they say that there's an opportunity in this entropy, there's been an open and frank discussion around a lot of the concerns that people have had, some of which is in good faith, some of which is not. And I think this has been a big part of the problem for a lot of my colleagues, a lot of other folks in health and medicine, trying to differentiate which ones of these things are good faith things that we can act on, that are right, that public health has been working on for decades, versus what are the ones that are not, and how can we engage on some things without adopting them all. And I would like us to think through how we do that and how we do that better. And through the engagement that I've been able to do over the past year, I've seen that's possible. A few months ago, I was able to organize a meeting in Columbus, Ohio, between public health, academic researchers, really well-regarded, highly cited environmental toxicologists in their field in public health, people from the grassroots community in East Palestine, Ohio, that had been impacted by the train derailment 3 years ago, people from MAHA, politicians, Tim Ryan, Amy Acton, who's the Democratic nominee for governor in Ohio. And we all got in a room. And before we did that, there was an incredible amount of concern from both sides. What's going to end up happening? Are we going to yell at each other, throw tomatoes, beat each other up? And what happened was we had respectful conversation around issues that most folks had some level of agreement on. Sure, we didn't agree on everything. And actually, the kind of biggest disagreement was between a regenerative farmer and a more traditional farmer around glyphosate and what we need to do, kind of in the near future. But we sat in a room for 2 days and we talked about policy options and we talked about how we move forward and what we expect in terms of accountability from not only politicians, but our public health leaders. It wasn't acrimonious. It wasn't the social media fights that I think many of us have gotten used to and feel like we need to wage to trounce the others and embarrass the other side. It was a representation of deliberative democracy in action. And I see no way forward, no cohesive and I think enduring way forward, particularly in health, that does not incorporate that in some way, that does not look at how we build coalitions bottom up, talking to community, including folks that may not agree with us or that we don't agree with, working through that to find spaces where we can work together, where we can trust, where we can build together, as opposed to assuming that we're just going to be able to, in 6 months' time or in 2 years' time, have a party get back into power and then flip the switch back on and say, it's 2019 all over again, or it's 2024 all over again. The reason that MAHA exists is because of a lot of the inadequacies that people had and saw with the public health and medical system that existed before this administration. This is a symptom of a lot of anger that came before, and trying to pin it all on RFK Jr. or Trump, I think is inappropriate. And I think it overlooks the lessons of truly the past decade where, in 2016, after the initial Trump's initial win, there was a lot of discourse on, we can't engage with these people. Everyone that voted for Trump is a this, a this, a this, or a this. And, we came to essentially a place where we could, of non-engagement. And I think we've all seen how that's played out. I think we've seen that not only was that not successful, that it brought back another term in which this administration has been more deliberately attacking things like public health, Medicaid, et cetera, things we hold dear. I worry that if we responded correctly in this moment to the issues that are being raised, sure by RFK Jr., although I don't think in any good faith, but more so by the 40% of people that identify with MAHA, the people in the U.S. that have had big concerns for a long time, if we don't address these correctly, I worry that we could have a scenario in the coming years where we get an even worse version of what we've seen with RFK Jr., where we get an even more sustained attack on vaccines and some of the fundamental public health infrastructure that keeps Americans healthy.
Well, let's talk about that bottom-up coalition building by trying to get our arms around who MAHA is and who also might be, I'd say unwitting MAHA supporters. So you referenced, for example, the 4 in 10 Americans who say they support MAHA in polling. And I've noticed that there's a lot of overlap with those who idea as such and those who hold MAGA in high regard. And then there's another set of folks who that's much broader, it's majoritarian, who express support for the MAHA ideas that you referenced in your piece as addressing environmental pollutants, the cost of healthcare, and have a bone-deep conviction that health institutions have been captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate. And my question is, who's up for grabs? And in a post-MAGA world, or at least a post-Trump world, how do we engage in a way to build that bottom-up coalition that you referenced? Does the linkage between MAGA and MAHA, present us with a mirage of people that we can engage? Is it actually a different set of people who are actually sympathetic to non-vaccine, I'd say, MAHA ideas that just have never been engaged in a political way by the left or the right that we should be focused on? Yeah. How do we do this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Look, I think there's going to be people who are just, will seem to be just kind of unreachable and maybe will never trust public health again, even if they ever did, after the experience in COVID. I'm not going to pretend that we're going to be able to pull 100% of Americans back in the fold to thinking that, collective responsibilities are just as important and maybe more important sometimes than, kind of individual freedoms, whatever it may be. But I do think that, we talk so much about like who these MAHA folks are. A lot of them, support MAGA, and a lot of them are libertarians, and maybe a lot of them are actually these old kind of, stereotypes of, the leftist liberal hippies that didn't want to get vaccinated and, were crunchy granola people. I think all of those things are true. I think that if we try to put people into these separate buckets, we're doing us and we're doing them a disservice, because I think this movable middle of folks that we talk about as like somewhere between, MAGA extremists and, people on the left that are just like liberal, and like somewhere in between, there must be this movable middle of folks that if only we can kind of push them into our camp by saying the right things or doing the right things, then we'll win. I don't think that that's true. I think that there are people in MAGA, a lot of people in MAGA, whose number one health concern is on healthcare affordability. I think that there are a lot of people on the far left who are the exact same, that have shared and similar concerns. I think that there are people in that movable middle that might be like a woman named Nancy in her late 60s, one of the people that I reference in this piece, who lives in suburban Ohio and thinks that, maybe her son's autism is somehow related to something environmental, maybe vaccines, maybe something else, but then subsequently went on and vaccinated her other child just on a slightly different schedule, but like otherwise is fully supportive of public health work. And that may be different than a 40-year-old father who's like fully anti-vaccine, which may be fully different than like a 23-year-old, in suburban Michigan who's like all about tradwife TikTok content and cares more about beef tallow than about all these other issues that, we may see on our feeds. So I think that there is this conflation of people in buckets, and that we need to reach them with the certain messages, just bring them back into our fold, and then we can own them. I don't think that's the way that this works. I think that so many people are so complicated and will adopt some part, if not large parts, of the either MAHA agenda, the public health agenda, the MAGA agenda, but that none of them are necessarily fully 100% comprehensively overlapping. And if we're thinking about a group as like MAGA, MAHA, we're not going to be able to talk to them. There's no way we're going to talk any sense into them. MAHA folks, maybe they might be the reasonable suburban moms. And then the people on the left, well, we got them already. I think if we're approaching it that way, we're setting ourselves up for failure because of the intricacies of what people believe, because MAHA means so much. It means environment. It means vaccines for some people. It means food. It means a whole host of things that undoubtedly, I would imagine that each one of us would overlap into some group or bucket that maybe we don't necessarily identify with. And that's why I think approaching in that way is going to be really problematic and is going to set us up for failure from the outset.
One of your other critiques was on the ambition, if you will, of public health. And just to read a sentence from your piece, public health has been too cautious, setting the bar for evidence too high. On ultra-processed foods, environmental toxins, and drug prices, public health's problem was rarely insufficient data. It was insufficient nerve. Say more.
I teach a class called The Historical Determinants of Public Health, why and where public health emerged, what it emerged for. Public health grew out of the social determinants of health before they were the social determinants. It was about fighting for clean water, clean air. Now, they thought that disease was, brought by miasmas and that, you should open the windows so that, the bad air would get like maybe the understanding of disease and illness was wrong, but like a lot of what we consider social determinants was right. Clean water, sewers, these are all things that public health fought for at the outset. And around 100 years ago, in the aftermath of the Welch-Rose report, Flexen report, kind of this realignment between health, medicine, public health, the field of public health went from the podium to p-values. We were more content with supporting footnotes and providing the documentation and the data behind why certain things should work, must work, or proven to work. And we sat back from the front line and started to do more of this supporting work in health. And I think that's fine. We need this data. Data is incredibly important. But what I've seen is that the demand for more data has increasingly become an alibi for inaction. I think we've all heard the analysis by paralysis, right? Like we have to make a choice, but we don't have enough data to make the choice, so we just won't make a choice. And one of the biggest critiques I've heard from my article is that public health has been doing all these things for a long time: environmental stuff, water stuff, food stuff, etc. But I don't think people recognize that that's the problem, at least as seen by the outside. If you tell a mother of a 35-year-old with autism that public health has been looking at the reasons why autism has been going up pretty dramatically over the past few decades, and you keep pointing to the same things and saying, well, it's a mix of genetic factors and environmental factors, and you expanded the definition, but you have nothing else more to add from that, what is the natural reaction going to be? It's going to be people being allured to someone who says, I don't know what's going on. Let me find out. I don't know that that's what public health should do, but what I want public health to do more is to stand up and fight. That is what MAHA showed. Ultimately, at the end of the day, even with, I think, the little policy impact that it's ultimately had, MAHA has showed that people want a field that's willing to do something, as opposed to say, we're not exactly sure. It could be this or this. Let me get some more data and we'll come back to you in 3 years. And I think we have so much of what the MAHA movement has been moving on has been built on the public health work of the past, and all the work that we've done, the data, the environmental stuff, the food stuff. Like there are whole departments on, food safety and the impact on chronic disease, et cetera, et cetera. But we have not been out in the same way connecting with the public. We keep thinking and having this discussion within the field about whether or not public health should be political. Seems like every month there's another piece debating whether or not public health should be political, whether or not it should be political. It is political. It is political. Pretending it's not political is like the dumbest thing that we can do. If anyone can think that public health is not political, I don't understand where they've been for the last 5 years. I think we lean into this and say, we can and should be political. Our field was political. We need to do this in a way that is not partisan. And I think that has been the biggest problem for public health, is trying to extract itself from partisan fights, thinking that we need to conflate one with the other. People want a movement that does something. And when they don't get it from traditional routes, when they feel like experts at Ivy League institutions are getting a bunch of money and not answering the questions that they have in their daily lives, or if they feel like the NIH is getting all of this money and it's going to these institutions and they create these really cool medications with taxpayer money, but then these medications are so damn expensive that we can't afford them. What's the point? What's the purpose? I think we need to have a coalition of folks who are willing to fight. And I think that MAHA has shown that it doesn't just, have to be people on certain issues. This can be a broad-based coalition of people that want to fight for health, all aspects of it, making healthcare more affordable, more accessible, making their food supply better, making it such that corporate influence and pharmaceutical influence on medicine and health is less pronounced. All of these things that are true good faith concerns of millions and millions and millions of Americans are things that people want action on now. And when we say, but we've been doing this for decades and decades and decades, like this is what public health has been doing, we need to understand why people will look back at us and respond, okay, if you've been doing this for so long, why does it seem like we're not getting any further?
Yeah. When I picture in my mind an activist who is fighting for, say, universal access to healthcare, I don't picture a doctor or an academic. I picture a regular person, a mom or a young person who's involved in politics. When I think of someone who's passionate about capital P, capital H, public health, it seems like that core constituency is either a government-employed regulator or scientist, or an academic versus an everyday person. And could it be that part of our challenge here is that because that is the core constituency, at least as I see it, they have these instincts that, that you've labeled as, too cautious, and I would agree in at least some cases, and have instincts that lead them to paralysis by analysis, both out of concern of, making sure that the data is perfect, and also being afraid to enter politics because, again, a lot of these folks are at institutions for which, there are hard lines set up and they are afraid to cross them.
I think that's absolutely right. Let me say two things quickly. One is my background is in global health. I have had to roll out non-food item distribution campaigns in the midst of hepatitis E outbreaks. I did not have the opportunity to sit and wait until I had a perfect line list and a full active surveillance program in Amti-Mancha to be able to go out and start taking hepatitis E seriously. Like, you had to act. And sometimes the data can be supportive and you need to set that up, but sometimes you just need to do something. And I think we do that, but I think we're more hesitant to fully jump in and fully commit. Now, I think that there is part of this that can be explained by what you're describing as what I see as maybe this further rift between the different types of public health, academic public health and kind of on the ground public health. The people like Katie Wells in Texas working with the Mennonite community to respond to a measles outbreak. That to me is more akin to the global health work that I do, where you just got to get in there and you got to go. You got to talk to community. You got to get them to trust you, because no matter what else you do, there's no damn way that they're going to trust you, no matter how many reams of data you bring, unless you show up at the cookout or you're engaged in a good faith way with that community. So I think that's one side, but that has become a smaller part, at least of the funding, the focus, and I think also a lot of the comms of the larger public health community. If you look what's happened over the past few decades, the disconnect between the money or the share of money that's going into things like NIH research, indirects, academic institutions, public health departments, and how they're growing and doing really good, important work. But compare that to where you have funding at the local level for local public health departments. One has gone up, one has gone down. And we saw so much justifiable anger, a year ago. I'm in an Ivy League public health institution. Our funding was cut. Many other places had their funding cut. But if you listen to what the anger was about at that point, particularly from the broader public health community, it was academic voices angry about what's going to happen to the research enterprise if all these cuts are made. I heard very, very, very little in comparison relative to that, that concern, that complaint, very little about the cuts to local and county public health departments. And I think that's where more of this happens. I think that's where more of the impact for public health is going to be. And look, I love the work that is done in academic public health. I think it is critically important. I think we need this data. I think without a lot of my colleagues doing this, we would be much worse off. But the reality is that the stakes are just not the same. the stakes of you sitting in an office and losing your indirects from 60 to 50 or 60 to 15%. And yes, having to close projects, having to lay off folks, those are bad, but the stakes are just not the same as a local health department in Texas who even before, Trump came in, lost a bunch of their public health money and had to lay off a bunch of people who otherwise would have helped them respond to a measles outbreak. There is a growing disconnect between those two things. And I'd like more of my colleagues in the academic world to recognize that and to be more outspoken about that. We can and should protect the funds that we need to keep the important work in data, in public health, in comms, all the things that are happening in the academy, the teaching of the next generation of public health leaders. But I also want us to spend at least as much time decrying the impact that these cuts are having on local health departments, because that is truly where the impact is being made or impact is being lost. And I think that is where a lot of the anger is coming from folks who see those cuts, who see what happens when their local, their county, and their state public health department just can't show up in the same way that maybe they have in the past, or maybe they need them to.
And let's end here because I've already kept you longer than I promised I would. When I asked you to do this interview, you told me that you'd already heard from a lot of folks about your piece. What was the reaction like?
I think well, it depends. The public reaction was that I was wrong. I've been duped. I think someone called me a eugenics supporting fascist. And for me, that was fascinating because I've never been called that. If you kind of look at my career has been focused on empathy, equity, and impact. The past year and a half of working with groups that I disagree with partially or maybe even fervently has actually made me more committed to all the things that I hold dear. I'm more pro-vaccine now today than I was a year and a half ago. I am more committed to equity, empathy, and impact than I ever have been as part of this process. But what I've heard in response to my piece was that I was selling out public health. I was supporting a movement that is destructive, that wants to make it such that people never get vaccinated again. All these things that I understand, I completely get from a lot of people who reached out to me individually or reached out, wrote things publicly. I get it. This has been a very destructive year and a half. I get it. I've seen it. I've witnessed it. My life is in the global health space where humanitarian funding cuts have led to an Ebola outbreak that I think will likely become one of the largest ever. This has been really, really, really bad. But I also want folks to recognize that one man is not a movement. You can dislike everything that RFK Jr. has done or Trump has done when it comes to health, and they have done so much that is destructive and bad. But also recognize that one man is not a movement, and there is a broader coalition of people that have a label, but who support many of the same things that we do. When you ask Americans what their number one concern is, it is not getting thimerosal out of vaccines. That's not even anywhere in the top, 100. It is healthcare in this country is really hard to access. It is really unaffordable. These are the things that people are concerned about, whatever their label is. And I want us again to recognize that we can't have public health without 40% of the public. And the other, I'll be quite honest and, transparent, the reaction to my piece has been enlightening because a lot of the criticism of me has been delivered in a way that is so derisive, that uses languages that is quite frankly, dehumanizing for people in our communities. You can completely disagree. You can disagree with the anti-vax movement. You can disagree with the MAHA moms. You can disagree, but the language that I've seen being used to talk about other people, our neighbors, people in our communities, coming from incredibly well-respected voices in health and medicine has been really disheartening. But at the end of the day, I am committed to making sure we build back and have a public health system in the future that can incorporate concerns and voices, that can listen to people, even if we don't necessarily agree with them, that can disagree respectfully, then they can ultimately build a public health that works for all of the public, not just the public that supports who we are, whoever is in power.
You can't have public health without 40% of the Americans. Can I borrow that one?
Please, you can have it.
Okay.
Yeah. And I will say, I've been incredibly supportive of, people tell me I'm wrong. I want people to critique. I want people to argue. I think this has opened up a debate and a discussion within our field that I think we need to have. And I might not be right about all things, any things. That's okay. I want us to have a conversation that allows us to kind of question not just what they, whoever they are, is doing, but also question what we're doing to make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. And we only get to that through, I think, good faith conversation and discussion, even within our field. And I recognize that's hard to do in the context of what we've seen and experienced over the last year and a half. But I want us to think about what this looks like in the long term, not what this looks like in 2 months, not what this looks like in 2 years, but how do we build a public health enterprise over the next 2 decades that people will trust, support, and will buy into. And I think that's going to take bigger conversations and discussions than, quite frankly, we've been having for the most part until this point.
Dr. Spencer, thank you for asking some tough questions, making people like me think, and for taking the arrows.
My pleasure. Happy to be doing this with you.
Thanks for listening. Hit all the buttons, subscribe, rate, and, we have an ongoing discussion about improving this background here. I believe that the next time you see me, if you're watching this on YouTube, that we're going to have something a little bit different, something a little cozier. Look forward to your feedback. Any suggestions, hit me up anytime. I'll see you next time.